So, Valerie, real pleasure to have you on the show. I'm really excited about our conversation. There's like a million questions I want to ask. I guess the first one, maybe you get this a lot, but what is the most misunderstood thing about artificial intelligence? The thing that you like constantly need to explain to people?
Hmm. Two things. First, AI is more a science of arts than it is a science of computing or mathematics. So it's actually a very creative process. It reminds me a lot of what I would witness when I was at Cirque du Soleil. There's an experimental side to it. So that's one thing. The second thing is AI is like a child. Giving it birth is maybe possibly the easiest part of it, although we could debate that as the mother of three kids. But like once they're born, that's when the real work starts. So AI grows, it learns, it makes mistakes. It needs to be taught how to reorient after it makes mistakes. So I think the second thing that I mentioned most often is AI isn't something you can just buy or plug in or implement. It's actually something you have to embed and nurture and take care of. And that's what AI adoption is really about, much more than the next technology that we kind of roll out in the company.
What got you excited, leaving the private sector to join the public sector? Like, why choose Mila? Like, why take that plunge into this, like this nonprofit essentially that's publicly funded? So curious to hear your motivation to take over as CEO.
The invitation to be a part of Mila at this point in its history was incredibly tempting. So, this opportunity to, capture or build off the work of giants like Professor Yasha Benjo, who spent decades against all odds, by the way, because not a lot of people thought this thing would work, but doing research and believing in what they were doing and arriving at this point in humanity's story where all of a sudden between supercomputers, super data, and AI, this thing could actually work, right? And to be able to do that here in Montreal, the city where I was born and raised, and do this, with Quebec colleagues and Canadian colleagues, and try to build something that is uniquely Montreal and uniquely Quebec and uniquely Canadian, but in the context of a huge transformation that's going to affect us worldwide, that was incredibly appealing. And then more specifically at Mila, I was very drawn by a vision that's shared by Professor Benjo and many of his colleagues that AI is going to help us in many different ways tackle some of the big challenges that we face collectively. So yes, AI, for marketing, and AI for smart homes, and AI for a bunch of applications that are maybe easier for us to understand as consumers. But how about AI for health, or AI for climate change, or AI for managing a pandemic? Like the potential of what can become possible when you combine artificial intelligence with human intelligence, and I'd even add with emotional intelligence, maybe we have a shot at this. Like if you put it all together, maybe we could be a part of doing something great and addressing some of these issues that on our own humans are struggling to tackle.
Yeah, it's a very interesting analogy that you bring up. I think it was the Google CEO that mentioned that the advent of AI is almost like the invention of fire, right? Like in the sense of it's going to have an impact across so many different fields, right? That today, like you said, it's the exciting time where it's like it really feels still embryonic. That now we're starting to see all these different companies like use AI in different ways where it almost feels like even like the moniker, like, like the joke in the startup world was like, adding AI boosts your valuation by, X dollars. But
Yes.
today it almost feels like that's passe. It's an expectation that you'll be using machine learning in some way in your software. It's not if, it's just how, right? So curious to hear you riff on how you see that on the research field, how it's changed research over the past few years.
Yeah, so interesting. So on the research field, really, there's still so much work to be done that I'd say most of the research focus remains just on the building blocks of AI. I sometimes describe AI as like a sophisticated set of Legos, right? Not the kiddie Legos, the easy ones that you can buy for $20, like the really big, like adult Legos, right? And so part of the genius behind it is building the pieces that will allow you ultimately to build a Taj Mahal, right? And so there is a huge portion of our researchers who still today do what we call fundamental research, which is what are these building blocks? And as you build the tools, as you build the technology, then you can start thinking about, if AI can do this, if I have a block that allows us to add this to the puzzle that we're building, then what becomes possible in the real world of application, right? And so there is a reciprocity between kind of how it can be used and what we're building. It's not that they're completely separate, but AI as a science is still very young. Professor Benjo sometimes says it's barely a toddler. There's so much still that needs to be built. And so as application accelerates, certainly it feeds into the creativity of the researchers who say, if only AI could do this, then we really could tackle some of these big questions, for example, on climate change. And so they feed into each other. But the work that's done at Mila remains mostly around these building blocks. And as they become available, what do they unlock as possibilities?
Yeah, that's interesting. So you mentioned how a lot of the applications of AI right now happen in the private sector, right? Like mostly, like the tech world, predominantly, right, if not exclusively, is where we're seeing people, take it, build it, code stuff. And you said so. You see this as a source of inspiration for researchers, but still, they're probably tackling order like questions that are not yet applicative, like that are not yet being answered on the field by software engineers that are working at like companies that are around you, right?
Exactly.
So that's an interesting that's an interesting insight as to like how early we still are. What do you find as your biggest challenge as CEO, right? Where it's like it's not like I imagine you just don't wake up and say, "Hey, okay, guys, we're doing this today." There's no like top down diktat that you can just like change, the direction of the organization. So how do you see your role of CEO? Is it like more of like as a cheerleader? Is it more of an influencer? So curious to hear as to like how you're able to enable change.
Yeah. So a few thoughts. The first is in the end of the day, or at the end of the day, my job, our job as kind of the support team at Mila is to make sure that we create the most exceptional environment possible for this science to be built, to be explored, to grow, and eventually to be applied, right? So part of it is really, you'll often hear Mila being described as a community. So part of our role is to foster this community and make sure that it has everything it needs to do the things it wants to do on a daily basis. And then I want to say that if I was forced to say a single answer to a question like this, I'd say talent, 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 talent. AI is often associated to computers, but AI is deeply about human beings. The industry of AI is human capital. It's people. It's people who understand this technology, who can use it, who can program it, who can evolve it, who can apply it. And so really, both within the walls of Mila and outside, when I look at the industry, it really is all about talent. And certainly, maybe even more so in the context that we're living currently, where all of a sudden the dynamics pertaining to talent are changing quite drastically because we realize that we can, work at home, live in one city, work for a company that's in another country. Like all of a sudden, all of these boundaries that we had created around the relationship between a talent and a project, they don't really exist anymore. So that's going to be very interesting for us here in Montreal, and then more broadly for the industry of how do we continue to grow this talent pool, and then how do we relate to it? How do we create these communities and these environments where people want to come together at the same time and work on a collective project?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's true because we're gonna talk about COVID and the impact of the pandemic and having nice offices that now you can't use anymore. In terms of a business challenge, is it a question of like a filtering challenge, like too many people are applying, and so we need to filter and find the best people, or there's simply not enough qualified researchers, qualified students that are applying? So then it becomes a challenge of how do we attract people to the field?
Yeah. So on the research side, Mila has the privilege of being very well renowned on the global scale, right? So we have the chance of having some really, really talented people from over 50 different countries who apply to be part of the programs that are run out of University of Montreal, University McGill, with the Mila professors. And so on that scale, we have the chance to build a community of like-minded people. This being said, the industry of AI in general, and then at Mila, we have a team of researchers who do applied AI projects. There's a lack of talent. There's not enough people. It's not growing fast enough. It's hard to reconcile the science with the application. And there's a growing pool of people who are good at that point of intersection between the two, but that's still being built. And so certainly what's happening now with these kind of more fluid lines between organizations and countries is it's going to be harder for an organization, whether it's Mila or a private company, to engage the talents they need internally to make sure that they have people within the organization that know AI. So that's going to be tricky. That's going to be tricky. And then even once you've figured that out, so let's say, we have the people we want to invite in, then the human dynamics within the organization becomes super important to take care of. Certainly at Mila, we've gone from 200-ish researchers to a community of almost 1,000 people in a few years. And so we're thinking about questions like culture, collaboration, communications, the typical questions you'd ask yourself as you grow and you rapidly grow to make sure that beyond the number of people, the DNA of how these people work together is still conducive to the excellence that you're trying to drive.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? Because with success, like comes the size and like the appeal, but then you need to maintain that scrappiness of like, when you guys were 50 people to now 1,000. So curious as to like, do you try and I imagine you do, but I'd like to hear you about like how you try and be more approach culture and approach collaboration, right? Do you say like, are there little tips and tricks that you can share as to how you maintained a collaborative environment and not one that's been, like that becomes, let's say, too competitive between researchers? Curious to hear you a little bit.
This would be a longer conversation, and I don't have the assumption
How
that we
much
have
time do you
the
have?
yeah. So we don't have the magic formula. So I'll put that forward to start, and I think it's a lot of trial and error. So I have a philosophy when it comes to kind of rolling out initiatives or programs that pertain to human beings to never think you've got the answer and don't overthink it. Like go where you feel there is potential, there's energy, pilot it, try it out. And then as human beings actually interact in the context that you're trying to create, figure out what your next move is. So if I had to say a few things, I'd say the following. Number one, Mila, the community, the way we discuss, the way we debate, the way we make decisions is deeply anchored in the set of values. And so that's part of how we're making sure that as we grow, the tissue remains coherent, is always coming back to these values in these critical moments of choice. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it, which is completely at the other end of the spectrum, is we've actually named some of these topics like inclusion, collaboration, communication, some of these key kind of DNA blocks. And we're proactively rolling out programs, let's call them workshops, where we have experts come in and we facilitate a conversation. And maybe there are 10 people who show up, maybe there are 100. But we put it forward that these are themes that we think are important to our community. And we try to create a dynamic interaction or conversation about that. And then more broadly, we try to just keep our eye on how the culture is evolving. So when I was at Cirque du Soleil as chief talent officer, I really believed in kind of the hard side or the data-driven side of the soft stuff. And so, for example, employee surveys are things that I believe to be very, very powerful in terms of having a bit of a dashboard of what's important to your people, where are they at, what are we doing well, what are we not doing well. It's not 100% of the answer, but it certainly gives you a portrait, and then you can react to that and say, oh, I didn't know that. There's, how come this is happening? What should we do about it? And so as best we can, we try to through different mediums kind of get a sense of what's going on within the community. And as you grow, of course, it's more and more important.
Yeah, it's good. It's that, yeah, using data, like you said, but like they kind of make sense. You guys are building AI, so like, using AI to be able to survey. And I imagine there's a human element. Sometimes you have to take someone on the side and course correct like certain types of behavior as well, which is harder to do like when it's like a nonprofit. It's more community driven. So using data to back up, let's say, that course correction I think that's pretty powerful. If we look externally in terms of like the image and like the actual impact, how do you measure the impact of the research institute? So like looking at your website and your annual report, and there's a number of research articles, obviously number of researchers and students. But curious as to, like, if you use your own dashboard, like what are the key metrics you're looking at?
Yeah, so Mila's mission, because it comes back to that, right, is to be a global pole for scientific advances. So first and foremost, it's a scientific institute, but in the service of what? We say in the service of developing AI and accelerating innovation for the benefit of all. And in the idea of benefit for all, part of it is kind of economic growth, economic prosperity for us all. And then there's this idea of AI for humanity, a bit like I expressed before, like AI applied to these big challenges that we're tackling. And so when you look at that, certainly the core of Mila, and it will always be true, is its talent and its science and how they come together to create this really kind of magnetic pole to what we're creating here in Montreal, right? So how many people do we have? Who are they? What are they interested in? And then what is the work that's coming out of these collaborations? Where is it recognized? Is it being cited? Is it being presented in these big global conferences where top AI researchers from everywhere in the world come and meet, right? It's very interesting. For a relatively small country, it's good to know that today Canada ranks fourth behind China, the US, and the UK in terms of a number of different metrics tied to the AI ecosystem we've built here, right? And certainly one of the areas where we score very strongly and that allows us to have this position is this. It's scientific excellence, right? It's Yoshua Bengio winning the Nobel Prize for AI, which is the Turing Award, right? And so that's a huge, huge piece of how we need to think about this. Now, when we created Mila as a non-for-profit organization 3 years ago, the idea was to use this attraction, this energy, this excellence, and transcend it to a larger community, which includes other organizations within the AI ecosystem, which includes private enterprise, which includes startups. And so here you can imagine dozens of different metrics, which are all about how are we interacting, how many companies, what are we doing with them, do the projects succeed or not? And you could eventually say, what's the economic impact of these projects? Now, the tricky part is the cycle is long, right? So it's not like we can start today and in 6 months I'll give you all the numbers, but the general conversation should be about that. Like, who is getting involved? What are we trying to accomplish together? Are we successful in doing that? And then ultimately, what's the impact for these organizations, or more broadly, for the people who benefit from the projects and services that are put forward, right? And so it's if truth be told, we're in the relatively early stages of mapping this all out. And at the same time, we have a pretty clear view of the different dimensions that are critical to all of our success. And I think in the next few years, we'll see more and more internally produced, but also externally produced reports or analysis that take a look at this and say, okay, 3 years in, 5 years in, 10 years in, where are we? Where do we need to make sure that we do more to stay competitive?
Yeah, it's fascinating because, like you said, it's such a long cycle. So I imagine you don't feel the need to quantify by like the application side, saying, "Hey, X number of startups were founded as a result." But if the quality of the inputs are high, so quality of the researchers, the people, and then ultimately the work they're producing, that will generate, like world-changing companies that are helping solve, like you said, climate. It's like amongst other challenges that we're facing. So it's interesting. I said, like, I'm just trying to think of where Mila is in the funnel. It's really sitting at the top of this funnel in terms of like having this impact. What are you most excited about what's coming down the pipeline in terms of where you guys are headed in the next few years?
I'm excited about, so this is going to be a bit of a philosophical comment, but I'm excited about AI actually becoming an accelerator to innovation itself. right? So no matter what the question is, AI as a tool allows us to be more creative and faster in asking these big questions that typically drive innovation. So for example, today, a group of researchers led by Joshua here at Mila are working on how to use AI to accelerate drug discovery, which we know is a really, really long process. And we've witnessed this, namely here in the context of the pandemic. But it's the AI in service of a process for creating more ideas, right? So I think that's going to have huge potential. And then we've named it a few times, but AI becoming more and more concrete and being applied to areas and domains that affect us directly in our daily lives, right? The education of our kids, the quality of the air that we breathe, the way that we are, supported when we have health troubles, from diagnostic to the treatment cycle, right? And so AI in all of these sectors becoming more and more concrete and going from kind of the lab to the home, and not only in the areas that we already know, but in these new areas that really kind of touch us in a more emotional way. I think that has huge potential, and it's something we're certainly very excited about. I also think that there's something that's happening in the industry more broadly. So this will be a bit more of my business comment, where, not surprisingly so, the tech companies and then immediately after the large companies were the first ones to kind of get on the AI train, if we want to use that image. And I think now kind of everyone else, which is the vast majority of our economy, by the way, are kind of, okay, so this AI thing has been around for a few years now. Everyone's telling me I need to get with the program. Like, clearly, I, as CEO of my company, I need to understand what AI is and decide how this technology, not if, how this technology can and will support what I'm trying to do in this world. And so as more and more people kind of become comfortable with the idea of AI, there's this whole new spectrum that's opening up, which is much younger, like much less mature, but has huge potential because now we're multiplying by tens of thousands of organizations.
Yeah, yeah. I think it goes back to your previous comment about Joshua, right? Like it's easy to look in the rearview mirror and say, "Oh, it was always going to be a success." But like Joshua, it's pretty well known that for almost 2 decades, if not more, a été dans l'obscurité, right? Like he traveled, worked completely in darkness, before winning, like you said, a Nobel
Yep.
Prize. So I imagine one of and then maybe it's not an accurate statement, but one of the biggest value adds of Mila is creating a safe space for new ideas to flourish, where there is no guarantee of success because there never really is, right? Nothing can be preordained, and that will let, like you said, a thousand flowers bloom, essentially. And like you said, the idea of this innovation ecosystem, is that a fair representation?
I love it. I love it. And Yasha would love it too. Yes. So creating this space where non-directed, right? It's not research for a specific objective. It's research for the sake of innovation can exist. And Canada historically has been really good in protecting that space. And that's what explains why we are where we are now, even though we are a relatively small country, like I said before. It's because researchers like Joshua got funding and got support from their universities. And we said, okay, we don't need to know yet if this is going to work or how it's going to be used. We believe in the idea and we want to encourage you to have a space where you can push it forward, right? Comes back to my comment around creativity, right? If this is more of an art than it is a science, you need to create space around it. You can't force the process too much, right? There is a bit of a process, and part of the dynamic for researchers certainly is the publication of papers. And as I create a space to be creative, I also need to kind of show the world where I'm going with all of this. But I love this idea of Mila creating a space for creativity that ultimately leads to innovation.
Yeah, and I think it's a leadership lesson, right? So maybe to pull on that string a little bit more, I imagine now in like three plus years, what other like important leadership lessons have you learned, right? That maybe you didn't know at the beginning.
The first thing I want to say is that, and this is not surprising, it's probably in all the leadership books that have ever been written, but at the end of the day, it really is about the quality of the people and the heart of the people that you bring on board. So I had a very particular context where I was one of the first hires of this new version of Mila. Mila is a non-for-profit organization that was a partnership between the different Montreal-based universities. And so I had the privilege to recruit in some of the people who today play really key roles at Mila. And I often tell them Mila could have all kinds of different shapes and forms. It would really depend on who's who's sitting in the chairs that today we're sitting in, and the spirit we bring to it kind of influences everything else. So I don't think as a leader you can ever underestimate the power and the importance of the quality, heart and mind of the people that you bring in. And then similarly, culture, which really what culture means is how people come together, is something that is very easy to push aside when there's a lot happening. It's very easy to push aside when there are other imperatives, when you're in emergency mode, when you're in building mode, if you're a new organization. And it's probably the exact wrong thing to do. Like ultimately, how people come together within and outside your organization is going to be the key to the success of everything you're trying to do, right? And so if this is one thing that if I could go back, I would slow down just a little bit to make sure that we're really taking care of each other as we're doing this. We're fine, but there were moments where, a bit like you were saying before, this growth and this acceleration of AI and everything that was happening and companies coming in and new funding and everything else, it does create a lot of noise. And you also need to just stop and see where you're at and make sure everything is okay and everyone is okay, and redirect depending on where we're at.
Yeah, Valerie, I think there's no better way to kind of end off the conversation with those key insights. That has been absolutely fantastic. I'd love to have you on for a part two to talk about just deeper, maybe exploring some of the projects. Final question for you would be is just where people can learn more, connect with you, and like learn more about Mila.
The best tool really is to follow us on social media and our website, which we're continuously kind of improving and adding info on. And we know a lot of people go there to figure out who we are and what we do and how to connect with us. But that would be my piece of advice. I think that's the best doorway into Mila for now.
Awesome. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you for your time, Valerie.
Thank you, avec plaisir.